Hey guys, tonight we're venturing into something a little earthy. Long before coffee, tea, or even bread, humans were experimenting with mushrooms. Not just for food, but for mystery, medicine, and sometimes mind-bending experiences. From ancient shamans in Siberia to priests in the temples of Egypt, these strange fungi have always had a story to tell. So, before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. I love seeing our little community spread across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe brew some tea, and let's drift back thousands of years to when humanity first met the mushroom and realized it wasn't just food. The first encounter, how early humans discovered mushrooms. Among the forest shadows, you can almost picture it, a dense, mist-soaked forest 10,000 years ago, where early humans roamed barefoot through the undergrowth. The air smelled of wet bark and smoke from distant fires, and scattered among the roots of ancient trees, strange, fleshy growths. Some bright red with white speckles, some pale and soft like damp bread. Mushrooms. Back then, humans didn't have the word for them, of course. No taxonomy, no culinary vocabulary. They were simply things that appeared after the rain. But to the ancient forager, the mushroom was both a mystery and a gamble. It could be food. It could be poison. It could be something else entirely. Archaeologists now believe that our relationship with mushrooms began long before agriculture, perhaps even before organized language. In prehistoric caves from Spain to Algeria, faint paintings show foragers with bundles of plants and fungi. In Tassili Niger, a rock mural over 7,000 years old appears to depict human figures holding what look like stalked mushrooms, surrounded by star-like dots. Some researchers interpret this as a kind of ritual scene, a shamanic trance, though skeptics argue it could just as easily be an artistic exaggeration of ordinary food gathering. Either way, it suggests one thing. Mushrooms captured human curiosity very early. Imagine that curiosity. The world was not yet cataloged. Every new plant or fungus was a question with no answer key. Our ancestors learned by watching animals, deer, boar, monkeys, nibble and survive or collapse. They watched, tested, remembered, and in that slow process of trial and error, knowledge grew like a hidden mycelium through time. Some mushrooms became prized delicacies, the early ancestors of boletes or oyster mushrooms, found on fallen logs. Others were feared, the lethal Amanita phalloides, whose milky white cap concealed death in a single bite. The line between nourishment and danger was thin, and yet early humans kept crossing it. Why? Curiosity, hunger, or perhaps, as some anthropologists suggest, the search for transcendence. It's easy to forget how spiritually curious our prehistoric ancestors were. To them, the forest was alive, not metaphorically, but literally. Trees had spirits, stones whispered, animals carried messages, and mushrooms, which appeared overnight as if from nowhere, seemed to come from another world entirely. They grew without seed or root, sprung from decay, and vanished as mysteriously as they came. To a Stone Age mind, they might well have been gifts from gods or ancestors. Over time, as tribes began to settle, mushrooms became part of both diet and ritual. In Siberia, the Amanita muscaria, the iconic red-capped toadstool, played a central role in shamanic practices. Consumed carefully, and often after being passed through reindeer urine to reduce toxicity, it was said to open the doorway between worlds. The shaman would drink, enter a trance, and speak with spirits. The community watched, silent, waiting for visions to return. Meanwhile, in Mesoamerica, long before Spanish conquest, the Aztecs revered their own sacred fungi, the Tiananacatl, flesh of the gods. When consumed, it was said to reveal the divine structure of the universe. To modern listeners, it might sound mystical or even psychedelic, but to ancient civilizations, it was simply another form of communion with nature. But before mushrooms became sacred or hallucinogenic, they were simply survival. In Ice Age Europe, finding edible fungi could mean the difference between nourishment and starvation. The high-protein, low-fat composition made them valuable during lean months. Mushrooms could be dried, stored, even traded. We know from Neolithic settlements that early humans developed methods of preservation, hanging fungi on cords near fire pits or storing them in woven baskets lined with clay. Some of these mushrooms had practical uses beyond food. Fomes fomentarius, known as tinder fungus, was carried by the famous 5,300-year-old ice mummy, Otzi. Found in the Alps, his body was preserved with a pouch containing dried fungus strips, nature's fire starters. The fungus would catch a spark from flint and smolder long enough to light kindling. To Otzi, mushrooms weren't just food or medicine, they were tools of survival. When archaeologists study these traces, what they find is fascinatingly mundane. In charred remains of Neolithic hearths, tiny spores cling to ash layers. In ancient middens, desiccated fungi fragments sit among bone and seed. It's not glamorous history. No great empires, no kings or wars. But it's the kind of history that explains how humans endured. The first people who learned to recognize a safe mushroom passed that knowledge on orally. The white ones on the birch are safe, one might say, but the yellow near the oak burns your throat. Over generations, such folk wisdom formed the earliest ethnomycology, the human relationship with fungi. In some cultures, this knowledge became ritualized. The Sami of northern Scandinavia viewed certain mushrooms as winter medicine. Chinese herbalists recorded the use of rasher, Ganoderma lucidum, as a symbol of longevity over 2,000 years ago. Yet, as agriculture expanded, mushrooms briefly lost their status. They didn't fit the pattern of domestication. You couldn't sow them like wheat, nor pin them like goats. They were unpredictable, stubbornly wild. And so for centuries, they remained a curiosity, food for the poor, or for those willing to risk a bad meal. Medieval Europeans often distrusted them, calling them toadstools, a name steeped in suspicion. Monks and abbeys warned that eating wild fungi invited temptation or madness. Still, peasants collected them. Every autumn, baskets filled with chanterelles, puffballs, and boletes made their way to village markets. Recipes appeared in monastic cookbooks, boiled mushrooms with vinegar or crushed fungus added to barley bread for flavor. These weren't gourmet dishes, but simple acts of thrift, making use of whatever nature provided. As centuries passed, something strange happened. While Europe hesitated, Asia refined. The Chinese perfected cultivation of shiitake and enoki by the 13th century, using logs inoculated with spores. Japan and Korea followed, turning wild harvest into careful science. Mushrooms went from mysterious forest growth to agricultural product. It was a quiet revolution, and one that reshaped diets for generations. By contrast, in Europe, mushrooms didn't become mainstream until the 17th century, when Parisian gardeners discovered they could grow champignons in limestone quarries, the damp, dark tunnels beneath the city. Thus, the Paris mushroom was born, ancestor of today's button mushroom. It was humble, white, flavorless by modern standards, but it marked the beginning of controlled mycology. You can trace an odd pattern here: humanity's gradual attempt to tame what was once wild magic. From sacred ritual to culinary ingredient, from spiritual vision to supermarket staple, mushrooms chart a journey as old as civilization itself. Yet, even now, they resist full domestication. They remain elusive, thriving in decay, in darkness, in the quiet corners of nature where life and death blur together. And perhaps that's why humans have always been drawn to them. Because mushrooms remind us that survival often begins in the strangest places, in rot, in shadow, in the overlooked. But here's the question: when did our ancestors stop fearing them and start using them? Not just as food or ritual, but as medicine, trade, and even power? That's where the story deepens, into the age of early empires, alchemy, and medicinal lore. The healers, the shamans, and the early mushroom medicines. By the time early humans learned which mushrooms could nourish and which could kill, something new began to happen. Curiosity turned into knowledge, and knowledge into purpose. The mushroom was no longer only a food to risk or a danger to avoid. It became a tool, something that could heal, numb, or even open hidden doors of perception. Long before the concept of medicine existed, prehistoric peoples observed how certain fungi seemed to hold invisible power. Some reduced pain, others soothed fever. A few, when consumed in small amounts, made one feel distant from the body, detached, as if glimpsing another realm. It wasn't chemistry they understood, it was experience. And over time, those experiences shaped early healing traditions that would echo through civilizations. Mushrooms as the first medicine. Let's begin in the deep forests of Eurasia, somewhere between myth and archaeology. In many Paleolithic and Neolithic societies, healers were not scientists, but mediators between the physical and the spiritual. Illness wasn't merely a sickness of the body, it was a disturbance in the balance between worlds. The healer's role was to restore harmony through herbs, chants, and sometimes fungi. When the Siberian shamans consumed the red-capped Amanita muscaria, they believed it allowed them to communicate with spirits to identify the source of a patient's suffering. They saw visions, yes, but also practical insight. To them, the mushroom was not hallucinogenic. It was sacred intelligence made visible. Even more fascinating, the shaman rarely ate the mushroom directly. Instead, they let reindeer, the same reindeer they herded, consume it first. The reindeer's urine, still containing the psychoactive compounds, but free from some of the toxins, was then drunk by the shaman or by community members. It sounds strange to modern ears, but this practice was a kind of early pharmacology, distillation by biology. The mushroom was filtered through the animal. Knowledge and safety increased with each generation of experimentation. Farther south, in the Indian subcontinent, early Vedic hymns mention a mysterious substance called soma, a divine drink said to grant immortality and enlightenment. Its exact ingredients are lost to time, but some scholars have proposed that soma might have been derived from the Amanita muscaria or possibly psilocybe mushrooms. The hymns describe it as both drink and deity. We have drunk soma and become immortal. Whether literal or metaphorical, the experience of transcendence, of seeing beyond the veil, was central. Egypt, Greece, and the mycelium of early medicine. As civilization rose along the Nile, the role of mushrooms changed. The Egyptians, masters of preservation and agriculture, left little written about fungi. Some suggest they were considered unclean, linked to decay, and therefore beneath royal notice. Yet a few scattered records hint at something different. Certain mushrooms, possibly agaricus species, were reserved for the pharaoh, a delicacy not of commoners, but of gods. The Egyptians believed that some plants grew from the tears of the gods. Perhaps the mushroom, sprouting from moist earth without seed, was seen as such, a divine anomaly. In Greece, things became clearer. By the time of Hippocrates, 5th century BCE, medicine was evolving into observation and reasoning. Mushrooms appeared in his pharmacological notes, both as foods and as substances with cooling or drying effects on the body. Greek physicians often categorized illness according to humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Mushrooms, in their taxonomy, were ambiguous, nutritious, yet prone to corruption. One wrong choice could disturb the stomach and shadow the mind. Yet Greek religion, unlike its medicine, embraced mystery. In the secretive Eleusinian mysteries, initiates drank a potion called kykeon, used in rituals celebrating Demeter and Persephone. Scholars debate its composition, but many now suspect it contained an ergot fungus, a cousin of LSD-producing Claviceps purpurea that grew on barley. This fungal trace, if true, connects Greek spirituality directly to the world of psychoactive fungi. Participants described visions of rebirth and immortality so profound that, upon return, they no longer feared death. It's one of those quiet historical coincidences. The same culture that gave us geometry and philosophy may have also practiced chemically altered consciousness as a sacred rite. Mushrooms in China, the elixirs of longevity. Meanwhile, across the world, China developed a far more systematic relationship with fungi. Ancient texts like the Shinnong Ben Chao Jing, the Divine Farmer's Classic of Materia Medica, compiled over 2,000 years ago, listed dozens of mushroom species for medicinal use. Chief among them was the lingzhi or reishi mushroom, Ganoderma lucidum. It was revered as the mushroom of immortality, painted on scrolls, carved into jade, and prescribed by emperors' physicians. Chinese doctors categorized mushrooms not as mere plants, but as spirit substances, shenji, capable of harmonizing life energy, qi. The language was poetic, but the effect was real. Reishi was used to strengthen the heart, calm the mind, and prolong life. Even today, its compounds are recognized for their immune-modulating and anti-inflammatory properties. To the Taoist alchemists of ancient China, fungi were a bridge between worlds, between life and death, yin and yang, heaven and earth. Because they thrived in decay, they symbolized renewal. The alchemist's laboratory was not unlike the forest floor, dark, humid, filled with hidden reactions. Some even sought to cultivate mushrooms in caves as part of their search for the elixir of life. Mesoamerica, flesh of the gods. Thousands of miles away, in the rainforests of Central America, the Aztecs and the Mazatec peoples already understood the spiritual and medicinal potency of mushrooms. They called them Tiananacatl, literally, the flesh of the gods. In ritual, priests consumed them to receive visions, divine messages, and healing insight. Spanish chroniclers who witnessed these ceremonies were both fascinated and horrified. To their eyes, the participants' laughter, weeping, and rhythmic chanting under moonlight looked like madness, witchcraft. Yet to the indigenous peoples, it was medicine of the soul. A healer might use the mushroom to locate the source of illness, sometimes understood as a broken relationship with ancestors or nature. After colonization, these practices were suppressed for centuries. It wasn't until the 20th century, when the Mazatec healer Maria Sabina shared her ritual openly with researchers, that the Western world began to rediscover what ancient societies had long known: that mushrooms can alter consciousness, perception, and perhaps even the spirit of healing itself. That Europe's uneasy relationship with fungi. While Asia and the Americas explored fungi with reverence, Europe remained conflicted. During the Middle Ages, mushrooms were food for the poor and suspicion for the church. Anything that grew in darkness, unseeded, unblessed, seemed aligned with sorcery. Monastic gardens avoided them. Folk healers, on the other hand, continued using them in poultices and decoctions, boiled puffballs to stop bleeding, wood ears to soothe throats, inky caps for fevers. By the 14th century, apothecaries began cataloging these folk remedies. In dusty Latin texts, fungi appeared with cryptic notes: fungus combustus contra ulcera, burned fungus against ulcers, or fungus ad oris medicamentum, fungus for ear medicine. These weren't wild ideas. Many mushrooms possess antibacterial or coagulant properties, but because fungi were associated with decay, their use stayed marginal, medicine of the desperate or the rural. The irony is striking. While scholars debated purity, peasants quietly used what worked: the hidden science of preservation and fermentation. There's another kind of use humanity discovered early, not medical, not mystical, but practical. Fungi were the invisible architects of fermentation. Without them, there would be no bread, beer, or cheese. Yeast, after all, is a fungus, microscopic, but essential. Long before we understood microbiology, ancient brewers and bakers observed that certain mixtures came alive. Grain left damp would bubble, fruit juice would sweeten, then sour, then transform into wine. This was not superstition, but observation of fungal activity, passed through centuries of repetition. Fungi, in this way, became silent partners in human survival, the unseen workers of civilization. By the Middle Ages, monks and abbeys had mastered fermentation as an art. Their stone cellars, cool and dark, were perfect for fungal life. Bread and ale were not luxuries, but staples, safe sources of calories and hydration. Fungi gave stability to diets where crops sometimes failed. A monk might not understand why yeast caused bread to rise, but he blessed it nonetheless, calling it the breath of God in dough. Plowed with rain from decay to divinity. To understand how mushrooms gained both reverence and fear, we must remember what they represented. They sprang from rot, from the corpses of trees, from dung and damp soil. They blurred the line between life and death. For ancient minds, that was both terrifying and sacred. The mushroom was an emblem of transformation, of what happens when decay gives birth to new life. And that symbolism appeared everywhere. Egyptian resurrection myths, Taoist immortality, Aztec visions, even Christian parables about renewal. Across cultures, fungi carried a quiet message that the world's endings are also its beginnings. Compass medicine, mystery, and control. By the classical and medieval eras, mushrooms had woven themselves into human systems of belief and healing. But power always brings control. Who could use them and how became matters of authority. Temples guarded recipes. Alchemists hid formulas. Healers faced persecution. In ancient China, Lingji was reserved for emperors. In medieval Europe, peasants who foraged forbidden herbs risked being accused of witchcraft. Yet knowledge persisted underground, like the mycelium itself. Farmers shared drying methods. Monks copied herbal texts. Shamans whispered secrets through generations. The more society tried to regulate the mysterious, the more that mystery adapted. Fungi always found cracks in the system, literally and metaphorically. By the dawn of the Renaissance, mushrooms had occupied nearly every corner of human imagination. Medicine, food, poison, symbol, sacrament. They could cure or kill, enlighten or terrify. They were part of religion and rebellion alike. And as global trade expanded, new species and uses would soon cross oceans. But before that happened, before the age of microscopes and colonies and taxonomy, one question remained. Did anyone truly understand what these strange life forms were? Were they plants, animals, or something else entirely? It would take centuries and one very patient natural philosopher to answer that. The classification and the first mycologists. By the time the Renaissance dawned on Europe, the mushroom had already lived 1,000 symbolic lives. It had been sacred and feared, food and poison, cure and curse. Yet for all that reverence and superstition, no one truly knew what it was. Was it a plant? A mineral? Some hybrid of decay and magic? For most of human history, mushrooms occupied a strange twilight, living things without flowers, seeds, or roots. They simply appeared after rain, uninvited and unexplained. It took a new kind of mind, patient, methodical, quietly curious, to begin peeling back that mystery. These were not conquerors or kings, but observers, the first naturalists, botanists, and mycologists, though they didn't yet have that word. What united them was not brilliance or fame, but an enduring fascination with the boring, the overlooked, the things that grew quietly underfoot. When observation replaced myth, the late Middle Ages were fertile ground for curiosity. As printing spread and universities flourished, the old walls between theology and observation began to crack. The monks who once warned of toadstools of temptation started keeping notebooks. Apothecaries collected samples. Artists, commissioned to illuminate manuscripts, began painting fungi not as symbols, but as subjects. In one illuminated herbal from the 14th century, a small brown mushroom appears beside thyme and nettle. No moral message, no warning, just a simple depiction. This small act of realism hinted at something profound, a shift from fear to fascination. The Renaissance magnified that curiosity. Naturalists began cataloging the natural world in earnest, classifying plants, animals, and stones. Mushrooms, however, continued to defy them. They didn't fit. They seemed to grow from nothing. Excremental birth, some said. Others called them spontaneous vegetation, the product of dampness and decay. Yet even then, quiet progress was being made. In Italy, the naturalist Pietro Andrea Mattioli included several fungi in his 1544 herbal, noting their medicinal and poisonous qualities. In Germany, Otto Brunfels and Leonhard Fuchs illustrated them in their herbariums. Their drawings were imperfect, mushrooms rendered like strange cabbages or distorted onions, but they were attempts at understanding. The art of description itself was a revolution. To describe was to admit that the unknown could be known. Yet even then, quiet progress was being made. In Italy, the naturalist Pietro Andrea Mattioli included several fungi in his 1544 herbal, noting their medicinal and poisonous qualities. In Germany, Otto Brunfels and Leonhard Fuchs illustrated them in their herbariums. Their drawings were imperfect, mushrooms rendered like strange cabbages or distorted onions, but they were attempts at understanding. The art of description itself was a revolution. To describe was to admit that the unknown could be known. The rise of the first mycologists. The term mycology wouldn't exist until the 18th century, but the groundwork was laid centuries earlier by scholars who refused to look away from the humble mushroom. One of the most influential was Pier Antonio Micheli, a Florentine botanist of the early 1700s. To most people of his time, mushrooms still seemed magical. Micheli disagreed. He studied them obsessively, collecting spores, slicing fruiting bodies, sketching their forms under primitive lenses. In 1729, he published Nova Plantarum Genera, a monumental work that changed natural history forever. Inside were 90 pages devoted to fungi, illustrated with exquisite copperplate engravings. Micheli proposed that mushrooms reproduced through spores, not by spontaneous generation. To prove it, he placed spores on pieces of melon and bread, and watched as tiny new fungi grew. It was one of the quietest revolutions in science, a patient man with a magnifying glass disproving centuries of superstition. His contemporaries laughed at first. "He grows mold on purpose," one critic said. But Micheli had opened the microscopic world to human understanding. The forest floor was no longer a place of miracles. It was a laboratory of life. Test tube fungi and the birth of biology. While Micheli worked in Florence, across Europe the study of classification was exploding. Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish naturalist, was assembling his monumental system for naming and ordering every living thing, a system still used today. Linnaeus included mushrooms in his Species Plantarum, 1753, though reluctantly. He filed them under the kingdom of Plantae, giving them Latin names but confessing that their reproductive organs are hidden. To Linnaeus, fungi were the messy border between life and death. Plants, perhaps, but plants that fed on rot. Even so, his naming gave structure to the chaos. Dozens of species that had floated nameless through history now had a place, however imperfect. Students across Europe took up the challenge. By the late 18th century, gentlemen scholars and local apothecaries alike were wandering through woods with notebooks, documenting fungi by the hundreds. They pressed specimens, drew cross-sections, and sent letters across continents describing discoveries. Some, like Christian Hendrik Persson of South Africa and Elias Magnus Fries of Sweden, became the first true systematists of mycology. Fries, in particular, treated mushrooms with a poet's reverence and a scientist's patience. Between 1821 and 1832, he published Systema Mycologicum, classifying thousands of species by color, texture, and gill structure. His language was precise, yet lyrical. They bloom in the damp shade as stars do in heaven, invisible until the light finds them. Compass the quiet revolution of the microscope. All this description, however, was still based on what could be seen with the naked eye. The real secret of fungi, their mycelial networks, spores, and microscopic structures, remained hidden until the microscope became common in the 17th and 18th centuries. Under magnification, a strange new world appeared. Fungi were no longer single curiosities, but sprawling colonies connected by fine white threads. Mycelium, the true organism beneath the surface. What we call a mushroom, scientists realized, was merely the fruiting body, the visible tip of a vast, unseen being. This discovery changed everything. It blurred the boundaries of individuality. A single organism could stretch for miles underground, linking tree roots, recycling decay, feeding the soil. Humanity had stumbled upon one of the world's largest and oldest living systems, and it had been beneath our feet all along. The microscope also revealed relationships between fungi and disease. Early observers noticed mold on spoiled bread, mildew on fruit, blight on crops. At first, they thought fungi caused decay. Later, they realized fungi were simply participating, breaking down what was already dying. It would take until the 19th century and scientists like Louis Pasteur and Anton de Berry to understand the mutual roles of fungi and microbes in decomposition and fermentation. But for the thinkers of the Enlightenment, fungi symbolized something more: the complexity of the natural world and humanity's limited place within it. Open book mushrooms enter popular imagination. By the 18th century, mushroom fascination had spread beyond scholars. Country parsons, amateur botanists, and even artists began sketching fungi with obsessive detail. In England, the rise of illustrated natural history books turned the mushroom into an object of beauty. Delicate hand-colored prints showed boletes, chanterelles, and puffballs rendered in sepia ink and watercolor. The audience for these books wasn't just scientists, but ordinary readers, people who walked their gardens and woodlands with curiosity. Still, mushrooms retained their air of danger. Collectors' manuals warned, "Eat no fungus unknown to your grandmother." Poisonings were frequent, yet the fascination endured. Some enthusiasts gathered mushrooms for aesthetics alone, pressing them between paper like flowers. Others cultivated molds for scientific study, marveling at their quick and secretive growth. In this era, mushrooms became metaphors. Poets used them to describe fleeting beauty, hidden life, or decay. Painters included them in still-life compositions beside skulls and hourglasses, reminders of mortality. What had once been a feared forest growth was now both symbol and subject, carrying the quiet weight of time itself. Knowledge spreads underground. While Europe's scholars classified and Latinized fungi, indigenous knowledge elsewhere continued in parallel, often unnoticed. In the Americas, traditional healers still used psilocybin mushrooms for divination. In Asia, reishi remained a symbol of health. In Africa, termite mushrooms were a delicacy and a cultural link between people and land. These traditions existed outside the academy, but preserved insights that science would later confirm: that fungi could heal, intoxicate, and transform. Modern ethnomycologists, those who study the cultural use of mushrooms, now recognize that traditional knowledge filled gaps that Western science ignored. So, while the microscope revealed the structure, folklore preserved the meaning. Together, they formed a more complete understanding. Science explaining the how, tradition remembering the why. Microscope, the age of discovery and the naming of the hidden kingdom. By the 19th century, the world of biology was being redrawn. Explorers brought back fungi from every continent. Expeditions from Britain, France, and Russia cataloged new species from tropical jungles and Arctic tundra alike. One explorer, Miles Joseph Berkeley, discovered that plant diseases like potato blight were caused by fungi, not curses or vapors. His work during the Irish famine, 1840s, linked fungi directly to global events, revealing how something microscopic could alter human history. And in 1859, as Charles Darwin published on the origin of species, fungi took on a new role as examples of adaptation and cooperation. Darwin's theory of evolution made mycology even more fascinating. Here were organisms that lived symbiotically with trees, decomposed death into life, and resisted clear classification. Were they primitive, advanced, or something entirely apart from both? By the late 1800s, scientists began to realize that fungi were not plants at all. They lacked chlorophyll. They fed not by photosynthesis, but absorption. Slowly, they were moved into their own kingdom, a distinct domain of life, neither flora nor fauna. It was a conceptual leap, and it began with the same quiet act of observation that defined Micheli's work centuries earlier. Candle, the legacy of the patient observer. What's remarkable about this history is not how quickly it moved, but how slowly. Each discovery built gently upon the next. No dramatic revolutions, no lightning moments of revelation. Only centuries of people kneeling in damp forests, looking closely at the world that everyone else ignored. In that sense, the study of mushrooms mirrors the nature of the fungi themselves. Knowledge spread underground, unseen, connected, patient, until, at last, it bore fruit. When we look back at those early mycologists, Michele, Linnaeus, Fries, we see a lineage not of fame, but of endurance. Their notebooks smell of mold and ink. Their pages curl at the edges. But in their quiet devotion to detail, they helped humanity understand one of the strangest, most essential forms of life on Earth. And yet, for all their effort, one question still lingered. If fungi could live unseen for centuries, linking entire forests in silence, what else might they be capable of? That question would lead directly into the modern age, to antibiotics, psychedelics, and the rediscovery of fungal intelligence. But that is a story for another night. The modern age of fungi, from penicillin to psychedelics. For thousands of years, mushrooms had lived at the edges of human awareness, whispered about, feared, revered, painted into margins. But with the dawn of the modern age, they moved from superstition into science. The same quiet organisms that once appeared overnight on a peasant's field now found themselves in laboratories, under microscopes, and eventually, in the bloodstream of modern medicine. And yet, their story remained the same. They arrived without fanfare, did their work in silence, and changed the world while most people were looking elsewhere. Syringe, the accidental revolution, penicillin, and the mold that saved millions. In 1928, a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming returned from holiday to his laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London. On his desk sat a stack of neglected petri dishes. Most were covered in the usual bacterial haze, but one was different. A small blue-green mold had spread across its surface, and around that mold, the bacteria had died. The mold was Penicillium notatum, and in that unremarkable patch of decay, Fleming had stumbled upon what would become penicillin, the world's first true antibiotic. It was, fittingly, a fungal miracle hiding in plain sight. Fleming noted in his journal that the mold appears to produce a substance capable of inhibiting the growth of certain bacteria. He didn't fully grasp the scale of his discovery, but others would. By the time of World War II, industrial production of penicillin was saving countless soldiers from infections that would once have been fatal. The irony was poetic. What had always symbolized rot and disease, mold, became the very thing that healed humanity. A fungus that thrived on death became the guardian of life. In a way, penicillin wasn't the beginning of modern mycology, it was its vindication. For centuries, healers and shamans had whispered that mushrooms held hidden powers. Science had finally caught up. The secret kingdom within. The 20th century pulled the veil back further. Scientists discovered that fungi were not just a biological curiosity. They were a kingdom unto themselves, older and stranger than anyone had imagined. Fungi shared more in common with animals than plants. Their cells, like ours, stored energy as glycogen. Their walls contained chitin, the same substance found in insect shells. And their survival strategy was symbiosis, living by connecting, digesting, sharing. Under the soil, mycologists uncovered a hidden web, the mycorrhizal network, linking roots of trees across entire forests. Through these fungal threads, trees traded nutrients and chemical messages, warning one another of drought, insects, or disease. Scientists began calling it the Wood Wide Web. What early humans had seen as mystical communication between plants was now proven, but it was fungi doing the talking. The same quiet organisms that decomposed the dead were also keeping the living alive. Petri dish new tools, new discoveries. The 20th century became an age of instruments. Petri dishes, electron microscopes, DNA sequencing. With each new lens, fungi revealed another layer of themselves. Some species could digest oil spills. Others could clean radiation or feed on plastic. A few produced compounds that altered human consciousness in profound ways. By mid-century, a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann was studying ergot fungus, the same grain mold that may have inspired the ancient Greek Kykean rituals. From it, he synthesized LSD in 1938, an accidental echo of the Eleusinian mysteries. Decades later, scientists rediscovered naturally occurring psilocybin mushrooms, long used by indigenous cultures, and began testing them for their effects on the mind. To some, these were dangerous drugs. To others, they were doorways. Fungi once again blurring the line between healing and transcendence. In 1957, Life magazine published a piece titled Seeking the Magic Mushroom, bringing Mazatec rituals to Western attention. Soon after, counterculture movements embraced psychedelics as both medicine and rebellion. The irony, again, was ancient. The same species humanity once used to speak with spirits were now being used to probe the depths of the psyche. Alembic, the fungal renaissance. By the 21st century, mycology was no longer a quiet field of curiosity. It had become a frontier of possibility. Scientists like Paul Stamets, Merlin Sheldrake, and Suzanne Samar brought fungi back into public imagination, not as curiosities, but as collaborators. They showed how fungal networks recycle carbon, nurture forests, and even enable ecosystems to heal themselves. They proposed mushroom-based packaging that biodegrades, fungal leather to replace animal hide, and mycelium that filters toxins from water. In medicine, the possibilities multiplied. Psilocybin, once outlawed, returned to clinical trials. Early results suggested it could ease depression, anxiety, even the fear of death. It didn't dull emotion, it reconnected it. Scientists found that psilocybin quieted parts of the brain that fixate on self and suffering, allowing people to feel wonder again. In a sense, mushrooms had come full circle, once feared, then eaten, then worshipped, and finally understood as a bridge between body and mind. Globe showing Europe-Africa, the oldest partnership on Earth. It's strange to realize that fungi have always been here, shaping life invisibly. They were the first to colonize land, breaking down rock to make soil. They digested wood before insects ever existed. They've guided evolution quietly, never demanding recognition. And now, in laboratories and forests alike, humans are rediscovering that we never truly left their world. Every breath of air carries their spores. Every plant root depends on their networks. Our food, our medicine, our very existence, all quietly entangled with fungal life. When you pick up a loaf of bread, when you sip wine, when you take an antibiotic, you're holding the echo of millions of years of fungal partnership. We think of ourselves as separate from nature, but fungi remind us otherwise. They dissolve boundaries between death and rebirth, between food and poison, between matter and spirit. Counterclockwise arrows button full circle, from forest shadows to fluorescent labs. If you trace the line back, from the sterile petri dish to the damp cave wall, from the lab coat to the fur-clad shaman, it forms one continuous story. A story of curiosity, of hunger, healing, and humility. The same impulse that drove an Ice Age forager to taste a strange fungus drives a scientist today to study mycelium under a microscope. Both are acts of faith, faith that something unknown might nourish or reveal. What began in darkness has remained there, in a sense. Fungi still thrive where light is scarce, in soil, under bark, in the human imagination. They are the quiet architects of life, working unseen. And perhaps that's the lesson buried within their history. That progress doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the roots. So, when did humans start using mushrooms? The real answer is, we never stopped. We've been using them to live, to heal, to dream, and to understand the fragile fabric of existence. Ever since we learned to look down instead of up.